In this lecture, I plan to introduce the Macedonian expedition into Asia. And Asia to the Greeks essentially denoted everything stretching from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush or Indus Valley. They had very little knowledge of the entire continent as we understand it today. And so for Alexander crossing into Asia in 334 BC, he was essentially conquering the known world, or most of the civilized known world for his generation. This invasion has been seen from a number of different perspectives. One wonders what exactly Philip had in mind, because he obviously planned this invasion, and Alexander fell heir to it. The best description that we have from antiquity is from the historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, and he wrote a work dealing with the rise of Roman power, but he couldn't help but comment on the war in Asia as conducted by the Greeks and Alexander the Great, because it created the world he knew. In Polybius's opinion, Alexander's crossing over to Asia was the beginning of a war that was essentially inevitable since the March of the 10,000 by Xenophon, which we talked about in a number of lectures earlier. Polybius's perspective is as follows. The nature of these factors is clearly enough indicated from the examples quoted above. He's talking about methods of history. Now, the true causes and origins of the war against Persia are easy enough for anyone to recognize. The first of these was the retreat of the Greeks under Xenophon from the upper satrapies, a march during which, although they traversed the whole of Asia and were constantly passing through hostile territory, none of the barbarians dared to stand in their way. This was the retreat of 401-399 BC, the so-called Anabasis, which I said was essentially a guidebook for how Alexander could conquer the Persian Empire. The second was the invasion of Asia carried out by the Spartan king Agesilaus, that is Agesilaus II, who invaded Asia Minor and penetrated deep into the Persian Empire, during which he encountered no opposition worth mentioning in any of his campaigns and was only compelled to return without achieving his aims because of the outbreak of troubles in Greece, for which you read Corinthian War. Thank you, Persian diplomats. These events convinced Philip of the cowardice and indolence of the Persians compared to his own military efficiency and that of the Macedonians. They also opened his eyes to the size and magnificence of the prizes to be gained from such a war. Accordingly, no sooner had he obtained the avowed support of the rest of the Greeks for his enterprise than he found a suitable pretext in his ardent desire to avenge the injuries which the Persians had previously inflicted on Greece. That was the burning of the city of Athens and its shrines, and the formation of the League of Corinth. Thereafter, he lost no time in deciding to go to war and put in hand all possible preparations for this purpose. We must therefore consider the first set of factors I have mentioned as the cause of the war, that is Xenophon, the second as its pretexts, and Alexander's crossing into Asia as its beginning. In Polybius's view, the war was inevitable going back to Greek clashes with Xenophon, Agesilaus, that this was the true cause, the idea, that Philip created a pretext to avenge the temples of Athens, and that Alexander carried out the actual war itself, and that was the beginning, the arche. In this way, Polybius is reasoning in a wide historical perspective, very much along the lines of other Greek historians, notably Thucydides. However, there is a bit of rationalization in all of this, and I contend, as we go through the following lectures, that we may well question Polybius's interpretation. It stands behind many views that somehow Alexander represented a pan-Hellenic enterprise. And it also raises questions of what Philip would have done as opposed to his son Alexander. And in my opinion, when Alexander crossed to Asia in 334 BC, he didn't have in mind any of these causes and pretexts as Polybius understood them in many later generations, but for him, it was a great heroic event. A reenactment of the greatest of all expeditions, that is, the war against Troy, in which his ancestors, Achilles and Neoptolemus, excelled. And as I stressed before, Alexander really took to heart these Homeric images. And these images probably meant much more to him and in time to his Macedonian army and even his Greek allies and mercenaries than the musings of Polybius about a grand historical set of causes. In any event, in May 334 BC, when Alexander invaded Asia, he took with him a superb army. And much of what we know about the Macedonian army comes from the account of Arrian, as well as other information, especially from Curtius Rufus, one of the Alexander historians, and reports in scattered sources, as well as archaeological evidence. The army is difficult to estimate in size. There were already some 10,000 men in Asia, commanded by Parmenio, who had secured a bridgehead. That is the strategic crossing across the Hellespont between the cities of Sestos and Abydos. That's where the ferry goes today. And essentially, it's the same point where Xerxes had built the bridge of ships back in 480 BC to invade Europe. The army crossed over with no particular difficulty. There were 160 triremes and other high-deck ships, including quinqueremes. These were a new state-of-the-art heavier ship. They were furnished by the Athenians and other Greek allies. Primarily, it was an Athenian navy, although commanded by a Macedonian admiral, a man named Nicanor. In any event, what apparently assembled in the Troad, the region around Troy, where Alexander visited the various tourist attractions, as well as the so-called Tomb of Achilles, and carried out various rites to both his own ancestors, Achilles, as well as Priam and the Trojans, so they would not go against him. He had in his army a Macedonian corps which was superb. There were 6 regiments, maybe battalions, you could translate it either way, of the phalanx. These were infantrymen armed with the great pike, the sarissa. They were the core of the Macedonian army. Each was a taxis, regiment or battalion, commanded by a taxiarch. The men who commanded these regiments, the taxiarchs, were superb officers. And in the 6 regiments that crossed over to Asia, several of those taxiarchs distinguished themselves and rose to high command. In fact, fighting in the phalanx was one of the key ways of distinguishing yourself and getting the attention of the king and eventually rising to command cavalry or independent columns. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So you had this wonderful corps of Macedonian infantry. There were also, at this point, 3,000 hypacipists. These are the equivalent of grenadiers. They took a position between the phalanx and the cavalry. They stood on the right flank. Within the hypacipists was a guard known as the agema, the personal guard of the king. And then, of course, there were the companion cavalry, the heavy cavalry, armed with a thrusting spear and body armor. They are organized into illi, or squadrons, and there were some 2,000 men, somewhere between 8 and 10 squadrons. The size of these squadrons is debated, and this was the core of the army: the companions, the hypacipists, and the phalanx. However, Alexander also brought along with him many other important military units. These included various Greek forces. Some 7,000 Greek hoplites served under the terms of the treaty arrangements of the League of Corinth. Many were likely mercenaries. All of them were under veteran commanders, either Greek veteran mercenary commanders or, in some instances, Macedonian commanders. There were also various Balkan contingents, and these people served out of alliance to Alexander as king of Macedon and their overlord. One of the crack units were the Agrianians, the javelin men, who are used to screen cavalry and infantry formations. They're used for all sorts of guerrilla operations, to seize advanced points. They're one of Alexander's favorite units, and they come from the highlands of Macedon. They're actually just beyond the Macedonian frontier, and these people are probably more or less Illyrian in descent. There was Thracian infantry and cavalry. And above all, Alexander had 2 advantages, which he inherited from his father, but I believe he also innovated on. One was the siege train and engineering corps that followed him. The expedition was virtually an expedition of exploration, particularly after 330 BC, when the army crossed the Tigris and really moved into regions that no Greek had ever seen before, and that is Iran, Central Asia, and India. Up until that point, they more or less were moving in areas that were either part of the Mediterranean world or at least within Greek knowledge, such as Babylonia. The Greeks had been to Babylonia, which would today be Middle Iraq. But once they invaded Persia, this was a whole new ballgame. And in the ranks of Alexander was a superb engineering and medical corps created by Philip, but in my opinion, greatly innovated by Alexander. These included men who could reckon distances and calculate supplies. The bematists, the men who actually did foot counting. They actually measured out the regions that Alexander traveled. There was also an engineering corps who become essential at the sieges. These are men who could construct towers. That is, towers that you would move up against walls, battering rams, various defensive sheds to protect the engines of war, artillery, catapults, and ballistae. And there is an argument to be made that Alexander's engineers improved the artillery significantly because in the three great sieges, and we will discuss several of them, at Halicarnassus and Tyre in particular, Alexander's artillery could batter down masonry walls, whereas apparently Philip, back in 340 BC, couldn't do it at Byzantium Perinthus. So we suspect there was an improvement in the artillery as a result of Alexander's encouragement, and just the fact that these engineers got much better at doing their job under both Phil and Alex. The logistical system is superb. There has been a groundbreaking work written by Donald Engels on Alexander the Great and the logistics of the Macedonian army, and it really is a marvelous read and study. And Engels has demonstrated that Alexander, and really we know very little information about this, that Alexander had inherited and again improved from his father the logistical system. The army that crossed into Asia in 334 BC, numbering some 50,000 men perhaps, would require about 125 tons of grain and 100,000 gallons of water per day just to move around. That meant supplies had to be secured from the area in which you were moving, that the Macedonian army could not stay in one region more than a couple of days. You have to think of this army as essentially a moving city. 50,000 combatants alone represents the size of a very impressive Greek city. That's a huge force. Furthermore, there were the draft animals and the war horses. War horses are enormously expensive and have to be replaced. They can only be marched so many days. They must rest. You have to find fodder. All of these details were worked out, and Alexander's army achieved record speeds in both marching and pursuit. And the reason is that Philip and Alexander both discarded carts. There were no wheeled vehicles in the army. Persian armies, for instance, as most Near Eastern armies, had enormous wagon trains and a cattle drive to go along with it. And Darius's army was lucky if it could move at, say, 6 or 7 or 8 miles a day. The army would stretch out for miles. There were an enormous number of carts and wagons. The Macedonian infantry and cavalry even carried their own arms and equipment. They used pack animals, but whenever possible, men carried the burden rather than animals. Engels has worked out that 3 men could carry the pack of an animal, and their water and food requirements are less. There are occasions where the Macedonian army uses pack animals. We know, for instance, to the visit at Siwa, they used camels when they were in Egypt, one of the earliest references to camels in Egypt. But on the whole, the supply system was superbly worked out, and as a result, the Macedonian army could achieve record speeds, forced marches of 20, 25 miles a day, which they could sustain for several days running, repeatedly. In fighting in Central Asia, the rebellious Persian satraps are always taken by surprise. How quickly Alexander can turn about and come to their territory because they rebel thinking that Alexander was just too far away. And there are repeated references to this. And the pursuit of Darius across central Iran is nothing more than, it's absolutely stunning. No ancient army ever again achieved those kind of record speeds. And so within the army of Alexander was a superb number of veterans, men who had had common service, who had had a unbroken record of victory under Philip, who were trained and in superb condition with logistics that really we wish we knew more, because it really was one of the most remarkable logistical systems until the time of Napoleon. Now, in addition to this army, Alexander had superb officers. And this raises the question of exactly how much of this incredible achievement, overthrowing the Persian Empire within 10 years, was the result of Alexander's inspired generalship or the collective achievement of the various Macedonian officers. There is a large body of scholarship that tends to favor the second explanation. And I should be honest in that I tend to favor the first explanation. I do not believe an army as large and as removed as far from its homeland as the Macedonian army was, could have functioned by committee. There had to be a single commander for whom these soldiers would fight, and at the same time for whom these officers would give their lives and their honor in his service. The officers were overwhelmingly Macedonian nobility. Even Greek mercenary and Greek allied contingents were usually commanded by Macedonian officers. And there are two major studies, the most recent one in English, which was released by Valdemar Heckel on the marshals of Alexander, provide the collective biographies of all these officers that served with Alexander. And if one goes through these and plots various careers, you can see there's a certain logic in the way the whole officer system operated. First, it would be deceptive to call these men professional officers as we understand it, or even as the French or Swedish armies would understand it in the early modern age. You think of the armies of Gustavus Adolphus or Louis XIV. They were first and foremost nobles. They were men that came from the expanded Macedon of Philip. That included many officers from those great western districts like Lynkesteris, Orestis, Elymaea, regions which were home to proud warlike nobles. Furthermore, they had gained estates, honor, and money in the service of Philip, and they would continue to gain that under Alexander. They had a sense of service and loyalty to the Argead family house, the Argead family, the royal house of Macedon, and that was one of the most important bonds between Alexander and his officers. Those officers represented two generations of men. One were those men who had essentially fought with Philip and represented Philip's generation. Many of them were senior to Alexander. Someone like Parmenio, who acted as second in command for the first 4 years of the expedition, was essentially Philip's age. Others, such as Philotas, the son of Parmenio, was anywhere from 10 to 20 years older than Alex. Another one would be a fellow named Clitus the Black, by which the Greek means a man who has black hair. There's a fellow called Clitus the White, meaning blonde hair. These are designations on the hair color, apparently, of these Macedonian officers. They all represented men who had really seen their service under Phil. There were then men of Alexander's generation. These included some very close boyhood friends. They would be men who would be enrolled in what is known as the bodyguard. There was an honorary bodyguard of 7. Somatophylakes is what they would be called in Greek. Some of them had been trained with Alexander under the tutorship of Aristotle. These included men that some of them became kings later, Ptolemy and Lysimachus, Leonatus, who carried the banner of Alexander and actually saved Alexander's life at the city of the Malai in India in 325 BC. His closest friend Hephaestion, who was almost the alter ego of Alexander, though a rather abrasive figure, wasn't popular among many others. So you had this group of boyhood friends who had been trained with Alexander and were devoted to him. There was also a wider generation of nobility, and these included very important men who commanded the regiments of the phalanx, men such as Craterus, Conus, Polyperchon, Meleager. All of them were of Alexander's generation, and they were promoted and rewarded based on merit. Craterus eventually rose to second in command of the army, and he had started out as an infantry commander and showed enormous initiative at the Battle of Gaugamela. All of these officers emulated Alexander, who always led the decisive charge wherever it was, and Alexander, by the time of his death, could show wounds for almost every major battle and siege. He was wounded at the siege of Gaza. He was nearly killed at the Battle of the Granicus. He was almost killed in storming the city of the Malai in India. In terms of bravery, no one had any doubt or question about it, and Macedonian officers were expected to perform the same way. And Arrian is extremely careful in recording these names. He's getting this information from Ptolemy, one of Alexander's friends, who eventually becomes king of Egypt after Alexander's death. And this sort of information would have been known throughout the ranks of the Macedonian army. What officer led the battle, how they distinguished themselves, and it is indicative of the importance of these officers that the regiments, the infantry regiments, were named not after the regions in which they were recruited. They're all regionally recruited, but after their officer. They speak of Perdiccas's regiment, Craterus's regiment. The identity of the regiment was very much tied to those officers. Now, that raises some remarkable points about Alexander, and that is, and I think a measure of his greatness, and why I come down on the side that Alexander probably should really get the credit for all of these victories. Well, not even probably. I'm pretty definitive on this. For one, just think of who these men were. For 10 years, he took essentially the nobility of Macedon on campaign, representing 2 generations. They were all proud and ambitious men. Every one of them wished to distinguish himself in the eyes of his king. And they were motivated by many of the same heroic traditions of Alexander. And just keeping these guys focused on a common objective was an enormously difficult task. And Alexander had to constantly use and get the best out of the men he had available, because he could only use those Macedonian officers in any kind of serious capacity. Very seldom would he entrust positions to Greeks, later on, when Iranian forces are recruited, they're ultimately put again under Macedonian command. Second, think of the talent that followed Alexander after his death in 323 BC. Some of those men, including the senior man Antigonus the One-Eyed, Monophthalmos, who was of Philip's generation and put in charge of Asia Minor, Antipater, who stayed as regent of Greece, Parmenio, the second in command, those represented the older generation, all of them fine generals in their own rank. Within the younger ranks, the secretary of Alexander, Eumenes of Cardia, who handled the military payroll and kept the daybook. Generals such as Craterus, Leonatus, a friend of his, Crater, even Ptolemy, who was very cautious as a general. All of these men are men of very high ability. In the case of Craterus, everyone thinks that, well, you know, he's almost Alexander in quality of ability. The same was true of Antigonus, Eumenes. It is extraordinary the types of men who served Alexander, and that is an index of Alexander's own greatness. He was never in awe of these men. He surrounded himself with the best of the nobility. He promoted based on merit. There will be several instances where he is defied by his officers, and there are 2 ugly incidents we must discuss, especially after 330 BC, when Alexander crosses into Iran and begins to court the Iranian nobility. But the officers on the whole stood by him. And even though his policies of accommodating the Persians at court was unpopular, many of them went along with it because, in the end, Alexander adopted a certain amount of Persian dress and ceremony to win over the Iranian ruling class, rather than just to exalt his own greatness and megalomania, as some would argue. Arrian makes note of that, so does Plutarch, and I think they're correct in that regard. So that Alexander, his generalship can easily be just tested by the people around him. And that is a measure of greatness for anyone. There's always 2 forms of greatness. One is to be truly great. I think that's the case of Alex. And the other is to surround yourself with intellectual pygmies so you look great. And more of us have done that than we care to admit. Finally, in the course of campaigning in Asia, Alexander reformed this army. He inherited the army from Philip in 334 BC. The army looked very much as Philip would have commanded it. It's expanded with Balkan and Greek forces. But when the army crossed over the Tigris in 330 BC, Alexander had to remount his cavalry. Many of the horses had died. He reorganized the cavalry from squadrons into what are known as hipparchies, units of 1,000 men. And into those units, he recruited Iranian cavalry who fought side by side with the Macedonians. He made greater use of Greek mercenaries. Well over 50,000 Greek mercenaries were hired in the course of the last 6 years of the expedition. They were often used as garrison forces. They were used for subordinate columns. He incorporated allies from the steppes. He mounted the so-called horse archers of the Dahai. These are Scythian people. In India, he learned how to use war elephants and incorporated the armies of various allied Rajas. And so the army, in many ways, transformed itself into an ever more imperial army in the course of the campaigning in Asia. And this was Alexander's doing. He had to reorganize the army, invent new tactics, modify the command structure. The wars in Central Asia and India required many more independent commands. Men like Craterus and Ptolemy got to command their own forces, so did Hephaestion. And so all of this is part of Alexander's effort to keep that war effort going and carry out essentially the conquest of the world. And this, again, is part of the genius of Alexander. He didn't just mindlessly apply the tactics of his father, and that army by no means was static. It's constantly changing, innovating on tactics, improving. Officers are being promoted. Men are being summoned to call to account for defeats. Alexander is very conscious of those who succeed and those who do not. In the whole course of the expedition, Alexander is never himself defeated, and only at one point in 329 BC, on the Polytimetus River in Central Asia, is a column, largely Greek mercenaries, but some Macedonians under collective command, encircled and destroyed by insurgent Bactrians and Sogdians led by Spitamenes. That's the only significant defeat through the entire expedition, and that was, again, a subordinate column. It is extraordinary that he had this army and that he had so little money to pay it. He essentially was broke when he crossed over into Asia Minor. We're told he had 70 talents. He was mortgaged to the hilt. At Miletus, he will demobilize the fleet because he can't pay for it. And they always say that Alexander had to conquer the world, not only for his own destiny to be the new Achilles, and also to meet Mom's expectation, because Olympias kept telling Alexander he was, after all, the descendant of Achilles. But the second reason was to pay off his creditors. Fortunately, the Persian king Darius III lost the war more quickly than he could spend out his huge reserves. And in the course of conquering the Persian Empire down to the first essentially 4.5 years of the war, Alexander is reported to have seized well over 230,000 talents, that is gold and silver bullion. Enormous sums of money, which was then coined as Macedonian regal coin and quickly solved all of his money problems. Despite all these advantages, that is the veteran soldiers, the officers, the amazing logistical system, the engineering corps of the Macedonian army, this was essentially unknown by Darius III. Persian perceptions of the Macedonian army, one would love to have what they are, but Darius had very, very little information on it. Macedon was regarded as, yeah, we once controlled that area as a funny part of a satrapy, and, you know, what is it? And when Alexander invaded in 334 BC, Darius III was taken strategically by surprise. Philip had been assassinated 2 years earlier. Darius and his satraps, that is his governors in Asia Minor, did not expect an invasion. Parmenio's advance force had essentially been driven back to the Hellespont. It was only holding a few towns. And to a large extent, Darius had major problems that involved the Egyptians and what to do on the northern frontier. And Macedon was a pretty remote concern. Furthermore, the Persian Empire was impressive. Now, Arrian and other authors in antiquity state that Darius III was responsible for the destruction of the Persian Empire. And in the two great battles in which Darius fights Alexander, the Battle of Issus and the Battle of Gaugamela, Darius flees the battlefield early in the battle. But that's because Alexander is about to capture him, and if he captures Darius, the war is over. So you can't, this was not done as simply an act of cowardice. It is clear that Darius was a generous and able king, that the Persian nobility stood by him, and when he was really ignominiously deposed by his satrap Bessus and then murdered, many of the Persian aristocracy at that point went over to Alexander because they hated what Bessus had done to their king. They blamed that satrap for Darius's death. Furthermore, many Greek mercenaries, in 334 BC, there may have been as many as 50 to 60,000 Greeks in Persian service. Many of those Greek mercenaries fought, held on with Darius despite his defeats, even after his arrest and deposition. Some of them actually went over to Alexander, deserting. They would not serve Bessus. Their loyalty was to Darius III. And Alexander appreciated that among those Greek mercenaries who had had long service under the king. So Darius III, for all of his difficulties and his drawbacks, was clearly regarded as a serious and noble king to serve. Furthermore, he had an impressive empire. It is difficult to give population estimates, but at the time that Alexander invaded Asia Minor, the Persian Empire could have numbered between 40 and 45 million residents. huge cavalry armies could be assembled. And there's no doubt in the great battles at Issus and Gaugamela, Alexander was greatly outnumbered. By how much is anyone's guess? The sources tend to exaggerate Persian numbers. But these could be armies of 20,000 Greek mercenaries, 30,000 Iranian cavalry, 100,000 additional combatants summoned from the empire. They were huge armies. In fact, Persian field armies were the largest armies in the Western tradition, and probably until the Napoleonic Wars. And the Persians themselves had a superb logistical system to feed and supply these forces, and they had their own engineering corps as well. Furthermore, they had enormous amounts of money, and they also had fleets. The great king of Persia could launch great fleets from his subject peoples in Cyprus, the Greeks of Cyprus, the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, and other people dwelling on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean. So it looked like sheer folly that Alexander would pit this army of 50,000 against the mighty forces of Darius III. And almost everyone concluded that this expedition was a foolhardy venture, and Demosthenes and many of the Greeks probably hoped that Alexander would be swallowed up in the depths of Asia, and of course their freedom would be then regained. Unknown to them, early in spring of 334 BC, Alexander had already shattered those hopes when he defeated the first Persian army on the banks of the Granicus.